Retto learned early that silence could be louder than noise. In the small Massachusetts town where he grew up, nights were quiet enough to hear the hum of power lines and the distant breathing of the forests beyond the last street lamp. The world seemed to pause there, suspended between a single breath and the next, and it was in that pause that music first found him, not as melody but as pressure, a need, an ache behind the ribs that demanded release. His father had been a machinist, methodical and unyielding, while his mother worked shifts at a diner. The home smelled of steel polish and fried food. It was ordinary, functional, and yet, within its walls, Gene had learned to create something that felt alive. He taught himself chords on an old, dented guitar his uncle had abandoned in the attic. He played in bedrooms, garages, and basements until his fingers bled, until the sound became less about music and more about exhaling the life he carried inside. By the time he was 26, he understood that music was both refuge and weapon. It was a conduit for anger, for love, for longing, for despair. When he joined a local band, they were 4 boys in borrowed garages with rented amps, chasing dreams that often felt too large to speak aloud. They were reckless and hopeful, playing to empty bars, to friends who clapped politely, to strangers who might glance once before leaving. Then Elsa arrived, like a sudden exhale in a room that had been holding its breath. She was 23, with eyes that noticed what Gene himself overlooked: the small rhythms of life, the imperceptible tremor of joy in a conversation, the shadow that crossed his face when he thought no one was watching. Her presence was soft, insistent, grounding. She did not demand his attention, yet it clung to her effortlessly. She became the rhythm beneath the melody, the heartbeat that kept him tethered even as he chased the music that promised escape. When the invitation to New York came, it did not sound like temptation. It sounded like necessity. The band had plateaued, gigs had grown scarce, fans thin. Gene saw the opportunity as a bridge, and Elsa's hand in his felt like permission to step across it. They packed what they could, sold what they could not, and left the quiet town behind. New York did not welcome them. It swallowed them whole. Gene played small bars with cracked neon signs, basements where the ceiling leaked, parties where the only applause came after the alcohol ran out. Every night, he returned to a cramped apartment that smelled of old coffee and the faint residue of damp clothes. Elsa worked long hours at a dispensary, greeting customers with a practiced smile while her body demanded rest she could not afford. They counted dollars together each night, tracing numbers on receipts like beads, trying to make sense of survival. Then came the mansion. The invitation arrived on cream-colored cardstock, heavy with purpose. No return address. No name beyond a scrawl that promised opportunity. Gene hesitated, almost ignored it, but curiosity, and the subtle urging of ambition, pulled him forward. The mansion loomed behind iron gates, nestled in a part of the city that seemed suspended outside time. Inside, silence pressed against him as if sound itself feared to trespass. Langelo appeared then, a man whose presence demanded attention without a single raised eyebrow, a smile or gesture. He spoke of one sunny records, of a life that waited, of how talent ignored was wasted, and how Gene had already proven he could reach heights others would never dream of. The contract appeared with an almost ceremonial inevitability. Yellowed paper, curled edges, a golden pen that gleamed unnaturally in the chandelier light. As Gene read, a sting erupted in his pinky. A bead of blood appeared. He did not remember cutting himself. When he looked back at the page, the stain seemed almost to pulse, crimson spreading slowly over the ink. Something in his chest tightened. The pen felt warmer than it should have, almost alive. Against a whisper of hesitation he signed. The paper shifted in his grip like it had weight beyond its fibers. That night the city sounded different. Every car horn, every distant shout, every hum of neon reflected something unrecognizable. Gene felt it beneath his skin, as though the air itself had been subtly, irrevocably altered. And in that altered air, he dreamed of music that carried not just melody, but power, An ache, an elevation, a warning. He did not know then that it would demand a price that could not be measured in money, fame, or applause. That understanding would come later, through empty hospitals, through the echo of cheering crowds, and through the quiet, fragile form of Elsa lying in a bed that smelled of antiseptic and despair. But the story began here, in that silence between wires, in the stillness before a storm that would not only test his music but the very limits of his love, his ambition, and his soul. Success did not arrive gently. It crashed. 3 days after the mansion, Gene's phone rang with a number he did not recognize. The ringtone sounded wrong, hollow, as if vibrating through more than metal and plastic. By nightfall, he was standing backstage at a sold-out venue, guitar in hand, replacing a guitarist who had fallen ill without warning. The walls vibrated with the collective anticipation of thousands of bodies, the air dense with heat, perfume, and the faint metallic tang of anxiety. Gene felt both weightless and unbearably heavy, caught in a tension that threatened to split him in half. Beatrice Knowles did not introduce him. She did not need to. The audience had already sensed the change, the new force standing behind the drum risers, adjusting strings, testing pedals. They murmured like a single organism, hungry, expectant, consuming the space with their collective gaze. When Gene played, something shifted. The sound carried authority. The crowd reacted not with appreciation but devotion. Each note drew waves of attention, pressing him to the stage floor, pulling him upward simultaneously. The chords reverberated through his chest as if the universe itself had tuned its resonance to his fingertips. Gene felt lifted, unmoored, as if the music were playing through him rather than by him. He closed his eyes and surrendered to it. Every nerve ending sang. Every pulse of sound was a lifeline. For the first time he didn't feel small. Fame moved fast after that. Too fast. Offers stacked before he understood what he was agreeing to, each one more elaborate than the last. Interviews blurred. Hotels became temporary corridors of sleep, each room smelling faintly of disinfectant and desperation. His reflection was no longer constant. It changed subtly every day, reshaped by the glow of screens, the glare of camera flashes, the unyielding focus of crowds. Gene began to recognize his own face in fragments, as if he had become a mosaic of other people's desire, other people's expectations. Yet the hospital never changed. St. Patrick's Memorial smelled of antiseptic and fear. Its floors were cold beneath his shoes. Its walls rang with the quiet beeps of machines, each one marking time he could not influence. Elsa lay behind glass, wires cradling her fragile body like a delicate, unnatural cage. Doctors spoke carefully, uncertainty wrapped in rehearsed professionalism. They did not know why she had collapsed. They did not know why she remained unresponsive. They only knew she was alive, and for Gene that was simultaneously everything and nothing. He waited. That was when the message came. This is the prize of fame, let her go. Gene's hands dropped to his sides. The phone quivered in his grip. The words were precise, almost surgical, severing any remaining illusions. He knew instinctively that the contract was not merely a piece of paper signed in golden ink. It was a current, an invisible architecture, a demand for something to anchor his ascent. And she, Elsa, was the anchor. Without her he could fly higher, but at a cost that gnawed at the edges of his soul. Gene felt the first wave of fear that wasn't tied to his career, to the streets, to the endless city. It was personal. Inescapable. He tried to ignore it. He returned to the stage, playing with a focus so sharp it felt surgical. Fingers flew over strings. Every note, every chord pressed against the walls of reality itself. The crowd worshipped him, their devotion tangible, almost solid, clinging to his skin. Gene played until his hands bled, until his chest heaved, until the room itself seemed to bend in response. But the hospital waited. It always waited. Back in the apartment, the air smelled of lingering coffee and unwashed clothes. Gene counted seconds before checking his phone. Messages from managers, from record labels, from Beatrice herself. Every text shimmered with promise and danger. None mentioned Elsa. Jean began to understand something he had not wanted to admit. The price was not abstract. The price was immediate, intimate. The golden ink of the contract had written itself not only across paper but across the fabric of his existence. Fame had a shape. Fame had weight. And fame had a name. In the dark hours before dawn, he returned to St. Patrick's. He watched her chest rise and fall, listened to the rhythm of the machines, felt the quiet hammer of uncertainty pressing against him. Outside, the city roared with life and opportunity, indifferent to the room that smelled of antiseptic and whispered prayers. Jean leaned against the window, letting the neon glow wash over him, and wondered if he had been given power or if he had been trapped by it. Either way, the ascent was undeniable, and every height demanded a sacrifice. Jean began to feel the weight of the contract not in words, but in the spaces between days. The city no longer loomed over him as a challenge. It moved with him as if New York itself were reshaped around his footsteps. Streets curved slightly in anticipation. Cabs slowed when he approached intersections. Strangers watched him with fleeting recognition that made his reflection fragment, multiple versions of himself pressed against glass and steel. Fame was no longer a concept. It had a body and it breathed. Yet, no matter the applause, no matter the endless offers and rising paychecks, the apartment remained too small, too empty, too still. Elsa moved like a shadow within it, fragile, pale, a presence defined more by what she could no longer do than by the life she carried. Her hands, once steady and capable, trembled when she reached for a cup of water. She slept more and when awake, spoke less. The joy that had once surrounded them now felt distant, a faint echo Jean could barely catch before it faded again. St. Patrick's Memorial became a second home, a quiet counterpoint to the chaos outside. Jean learned the patterns of machines by sound, the beep of a monitor, the hiss of a ventilator, the subtle click of a syringe pump adjusting its rate. Time there was unyielding. It measured life and decay in heartbeats. Doctors avoided speculation, their faces a carefully maintained mask of neutrality. "We don't know why," they said over and over as if repetition could substitute for understanding. But Jean knew. Somewhere deep in his chest, an understanding had taken root. The contract had rules that were invisible, cruel, and absolute. Elsa's body was answering them. Jean's own body began to mirror the strain. He slept in chairs, ate little, practiced obsessively when he could. Crowds became denser, their adoration almost suffocating. Each stage felt like a threshold where reality bent to his touch. Fingers burned from relentless strumming. Strings snapped mid-song. Yet he could not stop. Each note, each chord, felt like a negotiation with forces beyond comprehension, a conversation between ambition and obligation. Fame had sharpened him, made him more than human, and yet, simultaneously, less than he had ever been. Every performance left him hollow. Backstage, he would lean against walls, guitar trembling in his grip, and hear Elsa's name echo in his mind. He imagined her alone in the hospital, the faint rise and fall of her chest, the wires cradling her like delicate bones. And each time, the buzzing of his phone reminded him of Langelo's influence, quiet, omnipresent, unyielding. The messages were brief, precise, sometimes cold. He did not need to read them to feel the weight they carried. The golden pen had not simply inked paper, it had etched a mandate into his life. The city moved around him, indifferent to the hours spent in the hospital lobby, to the long nights at empty apartments, to the cold meals he did not finish. Managers and labels called, interviews were scheduled, more stages waited. They were relentless. They reminded him that every opportunity had already been paid for, even if the payment was invisible, intangible, and painful. Jean's dreams were no longer his own. He saw Elsa lying motionless, hears the machines whir and beep in a rhythm that does not belong to any world but that of obligation and cost. Shadows pressed closer in his sleep, shapes unidentifiable, voices speaking in echoes of contracts, offers and prices. He woke shaking, guitar in hand, as if the strings had absorbed some residual command that demanded performance. When he began to understand that the contract did not simply grant him talent or success. It exacted a cost in increments so subtle they almost went unnoticed until the damage was complete. Fame had a demand. The demand had a name. It was Elsa. Jean could see her faintly in every reflection, feel her absence in every hollow victory, hear her in the spaces where applause had no echo. And as the city roared around him, indifferent to her suffering, he realized something terrifying. The price was not abstract. It was immediate, intimate, and relentless. He had traded a life, not a metaphorical one, but the one tethered to his heart, for the ascent that was already reshaping him beyond recognition. And still he could not stop playing. Fame announced itself in Jean's life the way tinnitus follows an explosion, not as sound but as absence. Streets seemed to bend slightly in his presence. People turned without looking, as if gravity itself had shifted around him. New York no longer felt like a city. It felt like a stage meticulously arranged to test his reflexes, his patience, and his limits. Doors opened before he touched them. Offers appeared with uncanny timing. Cameras seemed to know where he would be before he moved. Every room he entered hummed with expectation. Yet the hospital never changed. St. Patrick's Memorial smelled of antiseptic, faintly of coffee, and the undercurrent of quiet despair that permeated every floor. The walls, white and immovable, reflected nothing of the city's bright chaos. Jean watched the machines marking time, the soft pulse of monitors that measured a life he could not influence. Elsa remained suspended between consciousness and unconsciousness, her body fragile and recalcitrant, yet fighting with a stubbornness that made the uncertainty feel even more cruel. Each rise and fall of her chest, each beep of a monitor, echoed in Jean's mind, mixing with the city's roar in a dissonance he could not reconcile. Jean's own body mirrored the strain. Nights bled into days without distinction. He slept in chairs at the hospital or in dressing rooms, guitar in hand, fingers raw. Meals became cursory, forgotten between interviews, sound checks, and backstage obligations. Time lost definition. The city had been reshaped by his presence, yet the hospital remained immutable, a place where nothing could be negotiated, bribed, or charmed. The crowd's devotion was nearly suffocating. Each show became a test of limits, both physical and mental. When he played, the notes were no longer simply sound. They were pressure, density, rhythm that bent perception itself. The audience moved as one, inhaling and exhaling in response to his performance. He could feel their eyes burning into his back, their anticipation pressing against the stage boards, the bass lines vibrating through his bones. Each note tore at his consciousness, but he could not stop. To stop was to yield. One night, after a particularly exhaustive set, he noticed blood on his strings. Tiny droplets scattered across the fretboard. He did not remember bleeding, did not remember the exact moment his body had become the vessel of sacrifice. He wiped them away mechanically, as though performing an incantation to continue. The music did not wait for wounds. It demanded continuation. The contract's presence had become corporeal. Not paper, not ink, not signature. Something beyond comprehension. Opportunities, danger, reward, and sacrifice entwined. Each choice, every performance reverberated against Elsa's body in ways invisible to others. Jean began to understand that the ascent granted by the golden ink had a double-edged dimension. The higher he rose, the more fragile she became. At the hospital, time had no mercy. He watched monitors fluctuate, subtle variations in her heartbeat echoing through the sterile corridors. Nurses recognized him, not as a visitor, but as a permanent fixture, a figure tethered to the inexplicable deterioration of life that hung over Elsa. Doctors ceased speculating openly, exchanging glances instead, acknowledging only the limits of their understanding. One Gene began dreaming in sound. Subsonic waves rolled through him, rearranging perception. In sleep, he felt concerts he had not played, crowds that had not existed, and a presence that whispered of the contract, of obligations, of unavoidable costs. He awoke exhausted, yet compelled. Instruments called to him as if alive, strings vibrating in response to a will beyond his own. The city continued its indifferent rhythm. Neon glared. Rain-slicked streets reflected light in distorted mosaics. And in the hospital, Elsa lingered in a state that was neither life nor death, each moment a precarious negotiation with the unseen forces now entwined with Jean's fate. Fame pressed upon him like gravity, the hospital pressed upon him like conscience. And in the quiet of those opposing pressures, Jean realized the ascent was not without cost, and that cost was measured in every shallow breath of the woman he loved. Jean stopped thinking of the contract as an object. It had ceased to exist as paper and ink. It became atmosphere, gravity, a pulse embedded in the air around him. Opportunities bent toward him, obstacles dissolved before they could manifest. Every interaction, every stage, every flash of a camera seemed orchestrated by an unseen hand. The city itself hummed in tune with him, subtly reconfiguring itself around his presence. And each time he felt the surge of power, Elsa weakened. Her hands shook more violently now. Her hair fell in finer strands like brittle threads of light. Bruises bloomed beneath translucent skin without cause, pale as moonlight against the hospital sheets. Machines kept her tethered to the world, compensating for a body that resisted existence. Nurses and doctors moved around her as though rehearsing for a performance in which Jean was both actor and audience. He became hyper-aware of the imperceptible details, the faint twitch of a vein, the almost imperceptible rise and fall of her rib cage, the subtle mechanical rhythm of the ventilator. She was fragile, exquisite, a human prism breaking under invisible pressure. Langelo never appeared again in person. He was a shadow in texts, a suggestion in signatures, an omnipresent force that threaded every opportunity. Jean began to perceive him not as a man, but as an idea, a presence that claimed authority without speaking, that shaped the world with omission rather than command. Every applause, every flash of cameras, every message confirming a sold-out venue reinforced the unspoken truth. The contract's demands were inexorable. Jean's own reflection became an alien thing. He caught glimpses in mirrors and windows and sometimes in the reflective surface of his guitar, where he looked like someone familiar and someone foreign at once. Each day, the fame carved away a layer of him that had once been unshakably human, leaving a sharper, more resonant version that was tuned to expectation, consumption, and performance. Each performance reshaped him. Each applause imprinted a mark that went beyond the skin. Back at the hospital, Elsa's room remained a still island amid the relentless tide of New York's noise. Jean studied her with the obsessive attention of someone tracking a fragile comet through darkness. Machines beeped with precise insistence, the only constants in an otherwise unyielding calculus of uncertainty. No medication helped. No explanation sufficed. Jean began to understand that her deterioration was not illness, but consequence. The contract did not ask for loyalty, it demanded life. And she, as the anchor to his ascent, was the price. He dreamed in sound now. Not melodies or harmonies, but vibrations that carried meaning, weight, and consequence. Concerts he had never played, songs yet unwritten, and instruments that moved as extensions of his body performed themselves in his sleep. He awoke exhausted, muscles tight, fingers raw yet compelled. The strings of his guitar sang under his touch as though aware of the invisible architecture now guiding every chord. Crowds became denser, the energy almost physical. Their eyes burned into him, collective anticipation pressing down like a tide. And yet, the cost, Elsa's body, fragile and failing, remained the unspoken one counterweight. Every step upward was mirrored by her decline. Each triumph carried a shadow he could not escape. In the quiet hours before dawn, Jean returned to St. Patrick's Memorial. He leaned against the window, watching the city lights scatter across rain-slicked streets, feeling the unnatural tension in the air. He pressed a hand to the glass, imagining that if he could, he would pull her into his world, where power might protect rather than consume. Yet the machine spoke in the cold language of inevitability, and Jean felt the first true weight of the contract. That ascent, no matter how glorious, was inseparable from sacrifice. Fame had a form. It had a rhythm. And it had a demand. Elsa was the measure. Jean began to dream in sound. Not music as melody, not rhythm as pattern, but pure vibrations that rolled through him, rearranging perception, rewriting his understanding of existence. He awoke exhausted, fingers aching as if they had played for days without pause. The strings of his guitar, once merely instruments, had become conduits of a force that pressed against reality itself. When he touched them, it was not music he heard, it was consequence. Time on stage warped. Songs stretched or collapsed depending on the audience's hunger, their eyes, their anticipation. Faces blurred into a single expression, rapt, expectant, consuming. The applause pressed against his chest, a tangible force that demanded more, always more. Each performance left him hollow and exalted simultaneously. He felt both infinite and imperceptibly small, as though the very fabric of his being had been tuned to some unseen scale. Backstage, his reflection became a stranger. He caught glimpses of someone familiar and someone unknowable, a mosaic of himself carved by applause, expectation, and the unrelenting pull of the contract. The golden ink had not merely written on paper, it had inscribed itself into the sinews of his life. Every success, every standing ovation, every whispered acknowledgement from industry figures became another mark, another layer, another cost. At St. Patrick's, Elsa lingered. Her form remained suspended between frailty and stubborn resistance, machines cradling her body with mechanical precision. Jean watched her rise and fall, noting the faint twitch of her hands, the shallow breath, the almost imperceptible signs of struggle. Doctors no longer speculated, they had been humbled by uncertainty. The hospital had become a cathedral of the unknown, and Elsa its fragile altar. Jean began to perceive the contract not as restriction but as gravity. It pulled him toward stages, toward crowds, toward an apex he had once imagined but never truly believed possible. The city bent itself around him, reshaped itself for the trajectory he had begun to follow. Opportunities were no longer doors, they were inevitabilities. The world seemed choreographed to his ascent, yet with every step higher the anchor that tethered him, Elsa, grew lighter, more fragile, more at risk of disappearing entirely. He noticed patterns in her monitors, subtle fluctuations that became rhythms he could anticipate. Each anomaly echoed through his body, each irregular heartbeat resonating in his chest as if he had become instrument and audience simultaneously. He began sleeping less, moving mechanically between rehearsals, performances, and hospital corridors, driven by a force he neither welcomed nor fully understood. In mirrors, windows, and the reflective surfaces of his guitar, he sometimes glimpsed Langelo. Not as a man but as an outline, a shadow, a presence that existed in expectation and consequence. He did not speak, he did not move. Yet Jean felt his gaze on him, the unyielding weight of a promise he had made without fully realizing its meaning. Success demanded exchange. And exchange demanded life. One night, a blackout struck mid-performance. The crowd froze in darkness, breath held collectively. In that silence, Jean heard something he had almost forgotten. The soft hum of the world itself, the static beneath all sound, the delicate tension of existence. For a fleeting instant he felt free. And in that instant he realized he could not remain so. The city, the contract, the fame, they all waited, patient and inexorable, and Elsa hung in balance, her survival uncertain. Jean leaned against the stage wall, exhausted yet unyielding. He understood in the marrow of his bones that the ascent had a cost measured not in applause, not in wealth, but in the fragile form of the woman he loved. And every chord, every note, every vibration that he now wielded was a reminder of what had been placed upon the scales. One night, mid-performance, the power failed. The lights dimmed to nothing and a hush descended over the audience. For a brief, terrifying moment, the roar of expectation vanished. Gene stood in darkness, guitar in hand, sensing a vacuum where the world had once pressed against him. Silence stretched like a living thing, dense, unyielding, and impossibly intimate. In that void, he heard it, the hum beneath all sound, the faint, omnipresent vibration that he had almost forgotten, the resonance of a city that had bent to his will yet retained a secret of its own. For the first time in months, he could not distinguish between music, consequence, and the pulse of life itself. The stage was no longer a platform, it was a crucible, and he was both creator and sacrifice. The lights returned, weak and flickering, and with them came the applause, a delayed, almost reverent acknowledgement that seemed to vibrate with an eerie intensity. Yet, despite the energy of the crowd, a hollow remained inside Gene, a void that could not be filled by recognition or praise. The cost of every chord was etched deeper into his consciousness, an invisible tally that counted every rise and every fall, every note and every heartbeat. At St. Patrick's, Elsa's heart faltered for 13 seconds. The pause in the rhythm of her life struck Gene as though a shadow had pressed against his own chest. He felt it without moving, a physical echo that clung to him with a cold insistence. Nurses reacted quickly, resetting monitors, checking lines, but Gene knew it was more than a medical event. It was a reminder, precise and merciless, that the contract demanded its price. Each performance, each note played in the limelight, exacted a toll on the woman who anchored him to the world. Gene leaned against the hospital window, hands pressed to the cool glass, neon reflections scattering across rain-slicked streets. The city continued its indifferent rhythm outside, oblivious to the weight suspended within sterile rooms. He watched the monitors tick upward, counting life in small increments, as if survival itself had become negotiable, a delicate experiment conducted without consent. Sleep became a stranger. Dreams carried him to stages he had never seen, songs he had never composed, and audiences that existed only in shadows. He awoke with strings pressed raw beneath his fingertips, heart racing, breath uneven. The boundaries between performance and life, between choice and consequence, dissolved into a single, unrelenting continuum. Langelo never appeared, never communicated directly, yet his presence was undeniable. It manifested in the timing of opportunity, in the shape of success, in the relentless precision of the city's response to Gene's movements. He had become less a man than a force, and the contract less a document than a living architecture through which all events, triumph and loss alike, passed. In the stillness between chaos, Gene realized the terrifying truth. Nothing he had gained could exist without the tether of what he loved most. The applause could not replace her breath. The lights could not substitute for her heartbeat. Fame had a cost measured not in currency or recognition, but in the fragile, irreplaceable life that hung in the balance just a few floors above. And so he waited, stage lights dimming behind him, the city humming beneath, and the world holding its breath along with him. The silence was alive, and in it, Gene understood that the next chord, the next performance might be more than music, it might be an irrevocable act. Gene stood at the hospital window as dawn broke, casting a pale glow over rain-streaked streets. The city below moved with its habitual indifference, neon lights fading into the soft gray of morning. Inside, in the room bathed in artificial light and sterile air, Elsa remained suspended between breaths, her fragile form framed by wires and monitors. Gene pressed a hand to the glass, feeling a distance that was physical, emotional, and existential all at once. No message came on his phone this time. No new summons, no text from Langelo, no congratulatory notes. Just the relentless pulse of opportunity waiting for him elsewhere, beyond these walls, in a world that had continued moving without pause. Yet the most important measure of his life, the fragile tether of Elsa's existence, remained unresolved, each heartbeat a question mark in a universe that offered no guidance. Jean had begun to perceive patterns in the unrelenting rhythm of the city, the stage, the audience, and the machines that marked Elsa's struggle. All were interconnected. Every note he played, every chord that rang out into a hall, pressed against the delicate equilibrium of her life. Fame was no longer a gift. It was a living, breathing entity with a precise appetite, and it had already taken its first installment. He recalled the golden ink, the old paper, the subtle blood that had marked the moment he agreed to the contract. At the time, it had seemed like opportunity, a promise of elevation, a chance to escape the limits of a small town and a stagnant band. Now he understood that it had been a covenant with invisible forces, a binding of energy and consequence, of rise and sacrifice. Elsa's survival was not merely uncertain. It was contingent upon choices he could no longer trace or reverse. He leaned closer to the window, watching the reflection of himself overlaid on the fading city. The man who stared back was both Jean Retto and someone else entirely, an amalgam of obsession, talent, and compulsion. Fame had carved away the ordinary, leaving a sharper, more precise instrument of performance. But the cost had etched itself into his consciousness in ways more profound than exhaustion or loneliness. The cost was measured in her breath, in her fragile heartbeat, in the quiet possibility that all ascent had already been paid for with life he could neither replace nor protect. Outside, the city roared, indifferent. Trucks rumbled, subways clanged, pedestrians moved in patterns Jean could no longer influence. Inside, the monitors whispered the only truths he could recognize. Life, suspended, fragile, delicate. Elsa's chest rose and fell in imperfect rhythm, a precarious balance that could shift at any moment. He could not predict the moment, could not prepare for it, could not negotiate with it. The contract's price was exacting, invisible, and relentless. Jean pressed his forehead to the glass, willing strength into a woman who had become the axis of his existence. The room smelled of antiseptic and faint traces of his own unwashed sweat. Time seemed to slow, elongating each heartbeat, each breath, each shadow cast by the monitors. He wondered not about fame, not about success, not about the applause that had once given him purpose. He wondered only if the life he had tethered to his ambition would survive this night. And as dawn continued to bleed into the city, as the world carried on indifferent, Jean Retto realized with a clarity that made his chest ache. He had reached the pinnacle of what the contract promised, and yet the one thing he could not control, the life of the woman he loved, remained suspended, a question unanswered, a consequence unresolved. Was Elsa still alive? Or had the price already been exacted in full? Thanks for making it this far. In the next video we'll find out what happens to Elsa and the impact it has on Retto. Hit the subscribe button now or you may not see us again. Thank you.